Welcome to the KIPS Personal Trainer Application Podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia, and I'm the president of KIPS, Scalable Concepts, and the owner of Time to Train Fitness. Today, we have returning a good friend of mine from the Highland Games, Coach Nick OBrien. He is currently one of the assistant strength and conditioning coaches over at Fresno State University, where he oversees the baseball team, wrestling, women's volleyball, and also women's lacrosse. And recently he launched his own podcast, The Strength Game, which is great for coaches to talk about the application of strength and conditioning. And I believe he also has the angle of athletic performance in there from their own perspective, if they were an athlete at one time too. So a really great podcast to tune in for. Nick, thank you again for coming on to do part 2 of talking about Strongman training application for athletes.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm stoked to do part 2.
Yeah. And, the reason why we are doing part 2 so quickly is that the episode 1, it took off. I told him that we're friends outside of this podcast. So we text and we chat, and it was something that popped in my mind right away was to get him on for another episode to talk about strongman training for athletic performance. And the first question we're going to go over was a rather unique one. Nick and I compete in a sport, the Highland Games, that is highly traditional. Some of the aspects of it relate to the culture and the history of Scotland, Ireland, and the Highland Games in general. And with strongman training, there are those aspects. When you think about strongman training going back to the Atlas stones in Greece and even some of the implements utilized, there you could see the crossover in different cultures, which is really cool to see. So are there any events or training styles that you've read or performed that are similar to the origins of sport in general?
Yeah. Hey, thanks again for having me on. There definitely are. I think Highland Games more than anything, like we've talked about it before, the traditional side of it, and there is kind of a splitting of the hairs of which direction you want to go, like in terms, especially like I think the biggest controversy is sheaf and whether or not people actually consider it an event. And strongman's kind of the same way. I don't think there's too many people that are sitting at one side of the fence yelling at the others about, hey, this is how it has to be done. I think it's been pretty open with knowing the tradition of it and kind of seeing it evolve over time into more of a sport from where it kind of started in history. But it's still got a lot of its roots in there. And some of the implements have changed, and how things are either judged or put into a competition element has definitely progressed to actually make it a legitimate sport, so that not only can we keep records, but there's some consistency and reproducibility across the board, because it's competed just like Highland Games all across the country, all across the world. So it's nice to be able to have, hey, this is what we deem as a good dimension for said implement. This is kind of a traditional marker for a distance or a time. Obviously there's going to be iterations of it everywhere, but for the most part, they're trying to get into a sort of pattern where we can reproduce it and have it from a novice level, an intermediate, all the way up to professional, and try to build up the sport and then build up some of the training aspects into general public as well.
One of the unique factors that I'm also a fan of strongman. I'm still learning about it, but I follow Brian Shaw on YouTube and just his training and his mindset, and I think he's just a great person to have a part of a strongman, and he's consistently been there. He's not off. I'm not trying to take any jabs at any other strongman, but he's not off doing other items to build their, and I get it, you got to make money in the sport, but he's just consistently been all about strongman. And one of the things I like about it is that you have your set events. We'll say I think it's push, press, some type of carry, some type of pull, correct?
Yeah.
And then what am I missing here with those?
Usually a load event. is kind of thrown in there. But again, like we talked about, I think on the last episode too, with the events, that's kind of what the makeup of it usually is. But
Mm-hmm.
depending on the level and number of days and stuff like that, or even the implements used, it changes. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's usually the structure of it.
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe they don't know the set exactness of it. I think they might have an idea of, what could be there, but they don't know the exact implement sometime. Correct? I think unless, depending upon the competition, I think, because I think the Arnolds might have they might tell them in advance some part of it so they can get that training in. But with strongman, um, in general, in the strongest man, I think I even just said the name wrong there, but the one that Brian Shaw's getting ready for now, he was talking about how he knows that there's going to be a variation coming up, but he doesn't know the exact implement that's going to be utilized, right?
Right. Yeah, that happens sometimes. I know even at some of the amateur and even like lower professional ones, there are a lot of times mystery events that people like to put on.
Mm-hmm.
And then from competition to competition or whatever federation you're competing in, a lot of them have different sponsorships or different type of implements they use or different sizes. So sometimes you don't even necessarily know. And there's a big difference sometimes from a certain kind of sandbag versus another sandbag, or like load height or anything like that. And like you said too, in terms of weight of implements and just kind of the environment, because a lot of times I want to say probably like 90%, 95% of competitions are held outside. So same as Highland Games, you have that element of the environment around you, and then different pavement. Is it on grass? Is it on sand? I mean, I know a few World's Strongest Man. One event particular that threw people off was a 3 or 4 sandbag medley where they ran into about 1.5 or 2 feet of water to get the implements, pick them up, bring them back. And a few guys like got gassed in the very beginning and ended up dropping the implements in the water. And it was just like not happening after that. The bags are supposedly sealed. I forget, but like stuff like that. And then even with the Arnold Festival, if anybody's ever seen some of the newer ones, Rogue and some other big companies, Rogue's the big sponsor of it. So they've been going full bore with what implements they've been making. And if you've ever seen Conan the Barbarian and you've seen the Wheel of Pain, check that out on YouTube and see either it in action or the process of them building it, because they reassemble that every year and there's only one version of it and no one knows what it weighs, like for in real life. And the same with like events like car deadlift or car squat, you're dealing with joint angles and stuff, and just like where the trunk is loaded, like where the engine is, where's the mass of the weight, different height of people, like how much flex is in the equipment. You can't be prepared for anything. And I know World's Strongest Man doesn't necessarily tell them everything until ahead of time, like a little bit ahead of time, but you still have a decent idea that there's going to be a press, a pull, a load, a carry, some sort of medley in it, or usually stones or something like that. But you got to be prepared for everything. It's kind of a strong version, like a real super strong version of CrossFit-esque, I would say.
The one event that I was thinking about, I forgot how many years back it was. I believe they were in some Asian country. I don't want to take a stab at it because I just don't want to guess wrong with it. But the little bit of background information, I do know that they get some type of general. I forgot what they call it, where they get to talk about the event, do a little bit of practice on it, just so they have some hands-on with it. I don't know what the exact familiarity with it, with the implement, but even when you do those types of sessions with the events, the one that's coming to mind in my hand where you can't prepare was where they had actual people sitting on the sides and they had to carry that load across a certain length, and you don't know that weight distribution and of those people, you can't prepare for that. Even though you try to prepare and get all your training in prior to it, there's no preparing for 3 or 4 people sitting on the side of something on your back, and it's not like you're gonna, oh yeah, I'm gonna get 8 people over to my training facility on a weekly basis, and I'm gonna try and carry them across the gym. That's a uniqueness to it. But
Yeah.
moving on and getting back to the athletic side of it, do you have any considerations that you personally take when selecting strongman exercises in relation to sport and season? I think that that's one of the unique aspects of the lecture that I first heard you talk about it months back. I forgot if it was in April, but you were talking about the seasonality of it, and I mean that's one of the aspects of athletic performance is how are you loading yourself in different seasons? How are you preparing the body, resting the body, and all that kind of stuff? What is your general approach to that?
Yeah. I mean, with any training consideration and like implementing something into your program, you need to know basically all the fundamental stuff like the safety, risk, reward concerns.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know training age of those athletes or your clients or whatever the population is. Context, what's your overall purpose? Like, what's the goal of the program? Equipment, space, all that jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of like season and sport, that makes a difference too, because if I'm only going to train a team for one day a week and say it's soccer, it's going to be a lot different of how I'm going to program any sort of strongman type training versus like my wrestling team that trains 3 or 4 times a week with me in the weight room and then is grappling constantly and grabbing onto stuff and constantly picking up opponents and throwing them down. So it mimics a little bit more of strongman than say soccer would. Not to say
Mm-hmm.
that the benefits wouldn't still help a soccer athlete, but when you're considering adding it in, you need to understand like what you normally would do with that training population and what you would do with that specific team or that specific athlete. So when I'm looking at it, a lot of what we end up doing when we implement the strongman stuff is in the off season. Risk reward, again, the timing. I get to work with my college players a lot more in the off season
Mm-hmm.
where the coaching staff kind of knows, hey, this is going to be the forefront. Our training is going to be strength work in the weight room, power development, and then depending on if it's a field sport, conditioning, like energy development stuff outside. So we try to get a little bit more in during that off season period. Teams like wrestling, we kind of put it in season and then kind of sprinkle it in depending on the sport and how often I'm going to see them in season and their travel schedule and stuff like that. But you can add strongman stuff to just about any program, whether it's a carry, whether it's, I mean, a deadlift, like we talked about, a deadlift and an overhead press are part of strongman. Maybe the implements are a little bit different, but you can still train kind of in a strongman fashion or training for maximal reps in a certain time period or sled pushes and stuff like that, depending on the season. And it sucks to say because it is a cop-out answer, but it does depend. And it depends again too on your familiarity with the implements and training it. But in a broad sense, we're trying to train the athletes to be better athletes. And then their sport for me is secondary because I don't like to do a lot of sports specific stuff. I mean, we'll do a lot of preventative work and prehab, and our conditioning will mimic the demands of the sport. But in the grand scheme of things, I need to prepare them for athletics and
Mm-hmm.
building strength, speed, power, mobility, conditioning work, all that stuff in a general sense is a lot of what strongman stuff already incorporates as general physical preparation. So it is easy for me to implement that into a program. And then like speaking to the sports side of it, like my baseball and wrestling teams come in 3 to 4 times a week. Volleyball, same thing in the off season, 3 to 4 times a week. lacrosse is dependent on where we are in fall, and since they cover a lot more ground on the field, we sometimes have to limit the amount of time that we spend in the weight room. So that makes a difference too with how often we're going to implement this into a program.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the first part to emphasize for me and anybody listening is understanding the sport that you're working with. You got to understand the athlete, the demands of their sport, what the uniqueness of it, and understanding how they move in their sport or across the field, or if it is an in-person or a close-up sport like wrestling. What are those demands placed upon the body so that you can prepare them for that? And something that you and I have talked about outside of this, and I think actually in the podcast episode as well, was talking about I'll call them multiplanar movements. And Strongman, how you touched on, does have those elements of the sport. So how do you do that in the training room? What do you just keep going? Don't worry about it. Okay. How do you prepare for that? And one of the things that I've come to talk about and even think about in new lectures is about, are you building an athlete, or how are you working with them in order to prepare them for their sport? So I think sometimes we get too caught up with that word of sport specific. And sometimes I think we get caught up in how are we putting that in our programs. And I think sometimes as coaches, we might cross the line, in my opinion, with too much sport specific items in terms of instead of just focusing on overall performance, like how you just mentioned with deadlifts, presses. Some of these are just fundamental elements of a program. So I think sometimes we get too down that rabbit hole of, oh, we don't want to do too much of strongman. We don't want to do too much lifting. Well, there's some fundamental movements that are just a part of a program. And we get caught up on some of these terminologies with athletic training. But I think you hit it right on the nose there with some sports, especially relating it to Highland Games, is that strongman training, there is so much crossover with it because they're both sports that have to deal with loads and moving through multiple planes. So how would you train those? And that's where I think some of the argument comes in. Is it, are you just doing bilateral training, unilateral training? And I think sometimes people just want to stick to what they've heard or what they've seen, and they get caught up on just doing deadlifts, just doing squats, when there are so many benefits in my mind of multiplanar training movements.
Yeah, so like you touched on a lot of stuff with basically how we end up deciding what goes into a program and what the benefits are going to be, and like, does it outweigh what they're doing on the field? So, or does it complement it? And that's a big thing. And like you said, understanding and knowing the sport, and then even to another level, the athlete and the style that a coach plays, like tactically, technically, that stuff does come into play, albeit from my point of view, depending on how much time you have with those athletes in that team, of a smaller portion of it. But like for instance, like all our sports, like they're not static. So like most strength sports are, where like powerlifting or even weightlifting for a smaller degree, where you're pretty much in place the whole time and you're only working through one plane of movement. So whether it be pitching or hitting or throwing or shooting or catching, receiving a ball in lacrosse, or transitioning down the field, or picking up and throwing someone in Highland Games, or hitting a cross court spike, all those things are going to try to touch every single plane. So it's not necessary for me to try to mimic those movements exactly in the weight room, but it is necessary for me to hit all those different planes at one point in time within a training session. And I really try to make sure I don't cram stuff in there just to throw it in there. But that's where knowing what our team specifically does or what the athletes need to do kind of plays a role, whether it be in the warm up, some of our active recovery stuff, even like us going through just body weight, like our lunge matrix series, where we're hitting basically a striked out position for a body weight lunge, a pushback from every conceivable position, which, yeah, it doesn't seem like it would be a lot of strength work, but in the grand scheme of things, we're trying to put them in positions where they have some motor control and coordination, and they have some proprioception, and then we can add some more elements to strength. But they're already going to do that stuff on the court, and they're going to do it in a more familiar aspect for them. So it's not really our job to double down on that. And for more than anything, for me, it's my job to complement it and basically do everything that helps assist them counteract some of the stuff they're doing. Because like my baseball guys, they're swinging from the same direction all the time, and it's always the same repetitive movement with that same weighted bat, and it's the same throw, same arm. The volleyball girls, there's not very many at all that are going to hit with the opposite hand. So being able to kind of train in a way that complements what they do and also prevents them from overusing that same sort of movement is helpful. And the strongman stuff is great because like carries and manipulation of some of those odd objects is great, because that's what's going to put them on a field or put them on the court and be able to express that strength in different planes. So it's not necessarily just giving them more load and making them do circles and spinning around and kind of doing everything conceivable, but it does help to build some strength, be able to brace and load something or pick something up and be able to kind of take contact and throw something a different direction. And that's part of the reason like I enjoy using it, and I think it has a big benefit for the players in the grand scheme of things.
A good argument that I've seen on, and if you've been on Twitter and you jump into strength coach Twitter, it's a whole mess, as many people will joke about. But one of the items, and I mean, this is part of even the title of, your profession, is strength and conditioning. And the whole argument of conditioning in off season and preparing your athletes for their season. And I mean, I remember I just saw something recently, was a strength coach talking about you're not there to, run them into the ground in the off season, that they can use they could use their sport to prepare their aerobic system to get prepared for the season, that they do not need to just run around a circle, run around a track in order to do that. Would you say that there are some correlations to strongman training? I would say that some of the events that occur, you're going to be hitting multiple energy systems. Do you see that benefit translating over?
Yeah. It depends on the sport, like how we would implement conditioning. And that is, I try not to get on Twitter and see those threads going back and forth. I think it's great to see those coaches kind of check the other one as long as they're doing it in a constructive way. But for the most part, it's, hey, you're dumb. This and this and this. This is how you're supposed to do it. The ones that are constructively helping each other and really trying to either question it without being like passive aggressive is great to see, because it gets to the point where it's regurgitated, and people are just agreeing with someone based off of either their name or their history as a coach or what level they're at. And it's not to say that the best coaches are always like in the professional level or at a certain school or a different program. I think there's great coaches at the high school level as personal trainers everywhere. So it does add a little bit of benefit when you are associated with a program or something like that. But at the end of the day, like, there's so much information out there. You have to find a way to decipher it yourself and come to your own conclusions. So
Yeah.
I'll get off my soapbox for that. But in
It's,
terms of like the conditioning though, yeah, there's some great strongman things that we can do, and different types of conditioning that you can implement. And big thing for us too is like being able to use it in season
mhm.
with like prowlers and some stuff that, and sleds, or even some carries to some degree as either like a finisher, or like a grip circuit, or a like lighter, like easier competition type thing, or even with the non-travel players. But the sleds and prowlers are great because there's not a lot of eccentric load, if at all, on them. So you can do them more in season, and you take a little bit of that pounding you get away from either a court sport athlete, or contact with a wrestler, or um, just the repetitive cyclical running that you get from lacrosse or another field sport athlete.
Mhm.
Um, we, again, like you said, we use it to complement it. At the end of the day, that is our title. I think the profession is trying to get away from it. It's just so recognizable that
Mhm.
strength and conditioning coach is just what we've been called. I mean, honestly, I'd rather be called just coach, or something, as long as someone doesn't call me the weight coach, something like that. It's hard to kind of encompass everything that I think that we do in our profession, even if
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily fall within the guidelines or our job requirements. I think there's a lot that goes into it. So being able to easily just define it under coach is a great way, I think, to not only solidify us in the profession and kind of validate it, but bring us to the level of sport coaches.
Mhm.
Because I mean, monetarily, like, financially, just respect wise, and I think that we do a lot for those athletes in a way that deserves a opportunity to be seen on the same level, or at least increased level. For the conditioning though, um, we do use it to complement stuff.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the sport coach, I'd hope, gets the majority of their conditioning and runs a practice that is perfect for their sport to prepare them for it. But and then does it in like a tactical way where, like, if anybody's ever read some of the soccer periodization books that come out of the UK, those are awesome. And with one of my former teams at another university, that's what the coaching staff was doing, and they structure the majority of their conditioning by manipulating the size of the field and the number of players are on it, or the time, the duration of stuff, along with the GPS that we were using. Like, I didn't have to do a lot of conditioning, if at all, ever. And if we did do anything, it was completely different than running.
Mhm.
And that's when we added some of our carries. That's when we added some of the sled work, or resisted runs, or even just bike and like some other lower alactic work, which is awesome to not have to worry about running a team into the ground.
Yeah.
And that's what, unfortunately, a lot of places do, because they like to see the end result of them fatigued and on the ground. And I am a proponent for testing and making sure that you have a logical progression and you know where your athletes are at. But just making them run to run is a bad thing. And if you've seen some, I think, I forget the NFL guy, I think it was the Giants quarterback that just completely died 60 yards down the field and tripped himself.
Mhm.
Like, at the end of the day, you do need to prepare for a worst case scenario thing, um, albeit it does not happen a lot. And knowing well how much my baseball guys actually run, is it a great idea for them to run a mile or a mile and a half? Maybe not. But at the end of the day, does it create a little bit of mental fortitude? Like, are they doing it together as a team? Do they hate me as a team? At least they hate me together, which is fine. But you know what? When, I think it was 2 years ago, we played a 19 or a 20 something inning game. I can't remember. It went to the point we had to stop. So are you prepared to be able to stand in the outfield for 6 hours? No. Well, okay. Well, you should do something along the lines to prepare for a worst case scenario. And it's different for every sport. And for our conditioning for strongman, it does help a little bit with that and offsets a little bit of the conditioning that we typically would do during a practice session. I know it's kind of long-winded, but
Makes sense. And some good insight there, especially I think the soccer component from the UK. And I mean, I'm always one to say that they're just so far ahead in the UK compared to us over here with just exercise science in general and how they train athletes and even how they treat the profession in general. But that's just my opinion on that. Something that is pretty cool to talk about as strongman grows, becomes more familiar, you start to see a variety of equipment making its way into mainstream fitness. You see a variety of manufacturers making items that you're like, well, what is that? And then you kind of think about it. And I mean, the first time I saw it was a treadmill that had handles on the side that you could plate load and do carries with. I have never used it myself. I just thought, oh, interesting. I don't know anything too far beyond that, but I would say that that is one example of strongman going into mainstream fitness and blending over. There are a variety of manufacturers that will make some unique stuff out there. I mean, you could go on Amazon today and buy some sandbags to do some sandbag carries with your athletes or shoulder carries, whatever it is that you want to program. What are some of the examples or even exercises that for just like we'll say general trainers that are listening in, that if they wanted to implement some strongman exercises with their clients, and it can be general population even, what are some of those examples that you could give them?
yeah, I think it's pretty cool that you start to see stuff like that. And even more companies start to add that in, and they see that there is a spike in increased like just awareness or a likeness for strongman type training or the competition side of it, whatever it ends up being. So I mean, the same with information, there starts end up being a lot of it then. And then again, figuring out what you should do. At the end of the day, all those implements are just tools. So what you use with them, and it's more about how you're going to use it with your clients or with your athletes more than anything else. I mean, the biggest thing that you can say, like for actually implementing stuff is just carries, honestly. Yeah. Like any gym that's worth a damn should have dumbbells and kettlebells. If it doesn't, you should definitely reevaluate what you consider a gym and actually find a training facility that knows what they're doing. But honestly, if you can, you should be able to get anything done and train any athlete, any client with just one barbell, one kettlebell, one med ball. I mean, just body weight if you really need to. You can do anything. And strongman evolved from like centuries of just picking up rocks or getting to the point where like the big three, like squat, bench, deadlift, doing that once a week or throwing bales of hay. Like you can get strong doing anything. So utilizing that stuff just as a tool is great, but in a setting across the board, you should be able to do carries if you have a kettlebell or dumbbell, even if you only have one size of it. I'm talking, you can do duck walks, you can do front rack carries, atlas carries, Zercher carries, overhead, offset versions of it, where you're carrying one implement low, one high at the same time, and kind of getting a contralateral pull. We've even used it the same way to use it as a teaching element, or even if you're limited on space, to just do an isometric hold and work on proper breathing, position, and posture with them, and getting that rib cage flare to pull down, getting their pelvis under in a right position before we even walk. Or if you're inside, a lot of times you can't necessarily you don't have maybe a 60-foot runway to actually, that's unimpeded, that you can carry something or carry a frame or barbell down. So being able to get a little bit time under load and teach someone how to properly hold the right positions is great if you're short on space too.
Mm-hmm.
And then even unilateral, just one dumbbell, one kettlebell, whatever it ends up being, is a great way to kind of introduce it. But I mean, we talked about it, like you can squat and bench, if you can deadlift, like you're already doing a lot of the things that pro strongmen do to train, because you need to train the fundamentals. But if you want to do some strongman-esque stuff, carries are your best way to start in pretty much any training atmosphere, any gym setting, or even at home.
Yeah. Something you had mentioned briefly in the other, when we're talking about conditioning, you mentioned finishers. Well, what are finishers?
For me, finishers are pretty much anything that finishes off the session. Whatever comes to my mind with the athletes. For me personally, when I train, it's usually like maybe a drop set of something and kind of preparing for a competition if it's a max reps in a certain amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
or it's a medley, like completely like just emptying the tank on a conditioning medley and adding a bunch of different events together to go, and usually going for either max distance or just as fast as possible. And then for me too, like giant sets, like doing 6 to 10 exercises in a quick succession, which is kind of arbitrary. But for the athletes, a lot of what we do is end up being competition or a conditioning element.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do some type of like medley stuff, or even lower, like giant sets, whatever you want to call it, circuit, like supersets, hub and spoke, whatever terminology you want to use. That's what we end up using as a finisher. And for me, it's a good time to kind of get the team to work together, challenge them a little bit, put them in a competitive atmosphere, or just get a little bit of extra work in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perfect for clientele or athletes too. Like if you really want to not do a disservice to who you're working with, and you know that they want to feel kind of torn up and they want to feel like they did something, even though you know as a coach or a clinician that what you did is the best thing for them, throw something in at the end that they really want to do. Like if you worked on hinge patterns and like push-up patterns and making like till you're blue in the face for 50 minutes, and your client wants to do like wants to look better and like do core work, or your athlete, like my athletes like to do core stuff. Okay, hell with it. Just slam that in the last 5 minutes as quick as possible, and they'll forget about everything you did in the middle and be happy to be like, oh man, that was hard. I was sore. You can do the same thing with conditioning. It's a great way to kind of put it all together and keeping them engaged. And honestly, for them, it's the best thing, bang for your buck, because they feel good about it. You feel good about the stuff you did in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and there's more buy-in with it all. And that's honestly how I treat finishers. And you can pretty much do whatever you want though with them.
Something that I'd seen years before was, and this pertains actually to NFL and the Seattle Seahawks, but it was specifically to Coach Pete Carroll, and how he liked to implement competition with the athletes just to get that mindset. And this will kind of take us to our podcast takeaways with the psychological benefits of strongman and with athletes. And I mean, that constant competition, and I know that some people, I think, sometimes take it too far with their mindset of, oh, I always have to be competing with everything. But with strongman training and the athletes that you've implemented this type of style with, what are some of those benefits that you've personally seen?
Yeah, that argument too, like you always have to be competitive. I don't know how necessarily I feel about that. I think everybody has a competitive itch, especially with something that they're passionate about. But there also is the athletes that are really good at it know how to, like, if you ever read the book The Switch, like, know how to turn it on and off.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they step on the field, like, everything else just fades away and they're laser focused on everything. Which I think honestly is probably the better side of it. I think the being competitive all the time ends up kind of crumbling everything around you. And if you're okay with that, that's fine. I mean, there are athletes that there's no balance to their life where everything's competitive. And I know for anybody, like, especially that are preparing for the Olympics, you have one shot in 4 years to prepare to do your best. And Olympics are not, if anybody's out there watching, the Olympics are not set up for anybody to succeed. If you've
Mm-hmm.
ever heard behind the scenes stories about how people have to get prepared at the time, it's a glorified television show. So unfortunately for some of the events, I don't know about all of them, but regardless of that, you have to be prepared to sacrifice some stuff to get to that one perfect day 4 years down the line. And on the mental side, that's pretty taxing on someone. So to be able to turn it on and off, I think is a better way to do it, and you can manage it. I think Pete Carroll is awesome at that stuff. I've read all his books on how he structured everything, and he has a really good holistic approach about, even from the way he talks to guys, the way he sets up the locker room, his mentorship stuff with the players, and how he delegates things for them to do, and how he wants the team to kind of be led. And he's pretty outspoken about that stuff, but in a laid back way, which is
Mm-hmm.
awesome to kind of see. For the competitive stuff and like the mental side, I think those go hand in hand. For strongman especially, I think we spoke about it like off camera too. Training for an individual sport is completely different than a team sport for most people to even process,
Mm-hmm.
which is cool to be able to use strongman for my team sport athletes, for them to train, like, quote unquote, individually for once, where if I succeed in this set or this finisher or this medley, whatever it ends up being, it's only predicated on my preparation and my willingness to do the work right now, or to not quit and have some perseverance with it. And like, we do some like bar hangs, or we do some grip challenges or max distance stuff like that, where we're trying to put you head to head against someone and see who quits.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's a bad thing to see within a team atmosphere. You're not trying to find the weakest link. You're trying to simultaneously push each other and increase the value of your team by making sure that you both are, I mean, it's a rising tide raises both all ships. So like, that principle is perfect for it. Like, I like to call it strongman strength, and you can call it toughness, mental fortitude, perseverance, like an indomitable will, whatever you want to call it. Like, I think the mindset goes hand in hand with your physical work and what you're actually accomplishing.
Mm-hmm.
And that mind body connection is huge. And that culture that we try to create, and I think that strongman really, like, the events and the competition, that stuff envelops, is awesome. And it's kind of beyond quantifiable, because it's not the same as saying, hey, you got stronger in this. Like, you can't measure, not that I'm aware of, you can't measure when someone's going to quit, or how this mentally benefits them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not specifically, but I think that it helps them not only put them in a place to succeed, you put them in a position where they can build confidence and they can do stuff on their own. And you can push themselves beyond limits, which is awesome. Psychologically, I think that's one of the biggest things you could possibly do with an athlete, is to build confidence and have them be successful off the field, breed competition, breed that teamwork, and all that camaraderie together every time you guys are together in the weight room and practice in the locker room, like traveling. Because if you're consistently doing that stuff and you're consistently pushing yourself in training, then it's only going to benefit you when you guys get on the field and you're either working together and you know that that other person, you can hold them accountable because they hold themselves accountable. And that's one of the cool things of individual sports. If you're good as an individual and you have that psychological benefit, that mental fortitude, that toughness by yourself, like it's only going to be amplified when the people to your left and right on your team are of that same mindset. And I think strongman is one of the cool sports and just training environments and modalities, and that you can actually implement in any program that's going to benefit them, not only physically, but mentally.
I dig it. I dig it. And just to briefly touch on it, just because I know we've mentioned it before with the Highland Games, and this kind of relates to you turning it on, turning it off with it, that was actually one of the hardest parts for me as a competitor in the Highland Games, was being able to turn it off, turn it on, because an element of the games is, I'll say, the camaraderie. And even though it's an individual sport, you, I'll say, generally should be talking with your competitors, and it's not like you are competing the whole time. You will throw in an event and then you will wait your turn, which sometimes is 10, 15 minutes, depending upon how many athletes are competing with you. And I will say generally it's well accepted that you talk with everybody and you are a friendly competitor. But, the second that you get into the ring, or whatever you want to call it, the trig, or I don't want to use terms that people are going to be like, what are you talking about? You have to turn it back on and you have to focus on that one event. And so, being able to turn it on, turn it off, that's a hard part. Going from a team sport mentality where you're just focused on that one sport, you're focusing on putting everything in for that 45 minutes or that 30 minutes or whatever that period of time is. And so, the great ones can do it, as we've heard many stories of really high performance athletes. And so it's good stuff to hear about, and really think about the application sides of it with strongman and how it applies to whatever sport they are competing in. It's really good stuff. So Nick, before we sign off here, can you make sure to give the audience your social media profiles, the name of your new podcast, and all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, for sure. And like on the psychological side too, just briefly, it is definitely interesting with sports like that, a throwing culture, because there is an element to kind of psyching someone out. Like, are they really like participating, or is this person really want to win? It's an interesting kind of game that people end up playing, even strongman too. Like kind of hyping someone up and cheering it. It's a balance of whether or not, like, what your goals are going to be, which I'll say. But in terms of my stuff, I just launched the Strength Game podcast November 6th now. So if you go to coachobrien.com, so COACHOBRIEN.com, all the stuff is there. It's on every major platform: YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. And then my Instagram and Twitter, which Twitter a little bit less of, is _N_OB. I'm active on Instagram a little bit more, which is relatively speaking. and then that's all my stuff from there. And then if you guys, like, for your listeners and everything, if you guys are interested in any strongman equipment, for the podcast, like the Strength Game podcast, and for your guys listeners, if you guys go to cerberusstrength.com and you use this code strength_game, you can save there as well.
Nice. Good stuff. Really good stuff. Thank you again for coming on for part 2 of this topic on strongman and athletic performance. I think that anybody listening can really, hopefully implement it into their programming with whatever population they're working with athletes, general pop, seniors even. I think that there's some application there. So thank you, Nick, for coming on.
Yeah, appreciate you having me, man. Looking forward to part 3.